Abraham Lincoln led the United States through its bloodiest conflict and helped bring an end to slavery, a fact that still reshaped millions of lives. Stay with me for a gentle, human look at the man behind the tall hat, a self-taught lawyer from a log cabin who used plain words, stubborn patience, and a surprising sense of humor to steer a nation apart back toward togetherness. You'll hear simple stories that show how his choices mattered, from quiet letters and courtroom debates to the big, dramatic moments like the Emancipation Proclamation. Think of it as a formal announcement freeing enslaved people in rebel states, and the 13th Amendment, the law that ended slavery everywhere. These aren't distant dates and cold speeches, they're lessons about listening, courage, and doing the right thing when it's hard, the same skills that help in family arguments, at work, or when deciding whether to step in for someone being treated unfairly. Expect a few laughs too. Lincoln loved jokes and was once known to tuck papers into his tall hat like a makeshift pocket, because history feels more human with a grin. By the end, you'll understand not just what he did, but how ordinary choices turned into extraordinary change. Early life in a log cabin. Abraham Lincoln was born into a poor farming family and grew up in a single-room log cabin with rough-hewn walls and a central fireplace that did double duty for cooking and warmth. He learned the rhythms of frontier life early, chores before play, steady work instead of fancy toys, and the constant need to help clear trees and build fences. His mother, Nancy Hanks, read to him when she could, and after her death his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, encouraged him to keep learning. She brought a gentleness and support that made a big difference in a household where every helping hand counted. Neighbors were close by necessity, and sharing tools, help, and even books was a common part of daily living. Formal schooling was sparse. Lincoln had only a few months of classroom instruction scattered through his youth, so most of his learning happened in practical ways. He practiced writing on scraps and carved letters on fence rails, and he worked through arithmetic problems while measuring logs or setting posts, skills learned on the job rather than from a textbook. He read whatever books he could borrow, including Aesop's Fables and the Bible, and a popular biography of George Washington that inspired his admiration for honest leadership. Borrowing a book was the 19th century equivalent of downloading an app. Sometimes it meant walking miles and convincing a neighbor to lend what they owned. Daily life in a log cabin taught habits that formal schooling sometimes does not. Physical labor built his strength. Splitting rails for fences became a symbol of his early life and later a quirky campaign image. Storytelling sharpened his mind. He absorbed language and cadence from conversations, sermons, and the handful of books at hand, and those patterns show up in the clear, measured sentences he used as an adult. Coffee boiled, meals were simple, and winters could be harsh, but those constraints honed resourcefulness. Fixing a broken tool with a slick bit of thinking was as valuable then as troubleshooting a slow computer is now. There was room for humor even in hard times. Lincoln reportedly amused friends with quick jokes and self-deprecating tales. Once, while working and learning by candlelight, he would have been the last to complain about a late-night study session. He had already spent the day chopping wood. His life in the cabin left him grounded, practical, patient, and used to listening. Those early patterns, hard work, curiosity, and the habit of borrowing knowledge wherever it could be found, shaped him into someone who could lead with both plain speech and deep thought. The making of a self-taught mind. During the 19th century Abraham Lincoln had very little formal schooling, only sporadic classroom time that totaled roughly a year, but he compensated by becoming an insatiable reader and an intentional learner. He filled gaps with books he could borrow. Aesop's Fables taught him how stories could carry moral weight, the Bible supplied a store of language and rhythm he would later use in speeches, and Shakespeare honed his ear for drama and human character. For practical knowledge he turned to arithmetic texts and law commentaries such as Blackstone and Kent, which functioned like dense rulebooks that he patiently unpacked on his own. He didn't have a classroom, but he had discipline and curiosity. Those two things often matter more than fancy diplomas. Books were only part of his schooling. Soil, timber, counters and courts taught him the rest. Laboring with an axe, keeping accounts in a country store, measuring land as a surveyor, and carrying the mail put him in contact with all kinds of people and problems. Those everyday encounters became case studies, a neighbor's land dispute became a lesson in property, a long conversation at a tavern a lesson in persuasion. When Lincoln later argued law or gave speeches, he had real scenes and real voices to draw on. Think of it as a kind of apprenticeship in humanity. He didn't only learn words, he learned how people behaved, what made them laugh, and what worries kept them awake. He used simple, practical techniques to learn, read aloud, copy the passages that struck him, and practice speaking until phrases felt natural. Reading aloud helped him hear cadence and emphasis, copying helped memory and clarified thought, practicing helped him test an idea until it stood up. One life example: when preparing for legal arguments he would write out his points and then argue them out loud, anticipating counter-arguments the same way a chess player imagines an opponent's moves. That method is still useful today. Explain something to an empty room or to a friend, and you'll quickly find the gaps in your own thinking. Humor and humility were secret ingredients in his self-education. He collected stories and jokes not merely to entertain, but to make complex ideas relatable. A well-timed wry remark could soften an opponent and make a legal point memorable. At campaign stops or in court he could take a heavy issue and show how it affected ordinary lives, then land a punchline that left people smiling and thinking. In modern terms, Lincoln practiced what teachers call contextual learning. He tied abstract ideas to everyday examples so they stuck. If you want to learn something difficult, try finding a story that connects it to dinner table talk. Chances are you'll remember it. The result of that steady, plain method was a mind that could read deeply and argue clearly without relying on formal credentials. He became a lawyer and a respected public speaker because he treated learning as a craft: collect sources, work them, test them in conversation, and always listen for what's left out. There's a practical takeaway here for anyone who wants to teach themselves: small daily habits, 10 pages a night, a short essay once a week, or a debate with a friend, add up. Lincoln didn't read to show off, he read to think better, and he practiced until thinking became convincing speech. The self-taught mind he built was patient, curious, and street-smart, and it kept refining itself through books, people, and plenty of plain hard work. Frontier hardships and family bonds. During his childhood on the frontier, Abraham Lincoln lived in a small log cabin with his family and learned early what steady, plain work really meant. The land had to be wrestled into shape, trees were felled, stumps burned and dug out, fences built from split rails, and a single field could demand weeks of backbreaking labor. Schooling was irregular and short, a few months at a time was typical, so learning often happened between chores. Meals were simple and shared, and cold nights were fought off with a close stove, a patched quilt, and the kind of talk that stitches people together. His mother's death while he was still a child left a wound in the family, and the arrival of his stepmother brought a different kind of warmth and steadiness into the household. She encouraged reading and household order, and she treated the lanky, awkward youth with practical kindness. Older siblings and neighbors pitched in when work was too much for one household alone, barns were raised together, milk was skimmed and shared, and a helping hand could mean the difference between a saved harvest and a lost one. Those neighbors were not just helpers, they were an extended family by necessity, and that everyday reciprocity shaped how people treated one another. Books were prized in that world because knowledge multiplied a person's options far more than a new ox. Lincoln borrowed and read whatever he could find: the Bible, Aesop's fables, and other practical volumes, sometimes walking long distances to borrow a book. He read by firelight after a day of work, which is easier said than done when you have blisters. Practical skills, too, were learned at home: repairing a roof with raw timber, making soap from animal fat, and sharpening an axe to split fence rails. He split rails as work and as a kind of apprenticeship in patience. Apparently he sharpened axes so often that a person could joke he split more wood than words. Hardship and family closeness taught habits that lasted. He learned to listen, to measure his speech, and to find quiet humor in awkward situations, all useful in both home and community. Small acts mattered: a sibling's promise to take the last chore, a neighbor stopping by with a warm stew, a mother or stepmother insisting on a book before bed. Those everyday patterns of mutual care and resilience did more than keep a frontier family alive, they planted the roots of empathy and steadiness that showed up later in how he related to people. And yes, the irony is plain, a man formed by such rough work became known for careful words, but you could say those words were forged on the anvil of a very practical life. Formative influences and favorite books. Lincoln grew up in a household where work and books shared the same small table. His formal schooling was minimal, so most of what he learned came from reading on his own and from the patient encouragement of people around him, particularly a stepmother who gave him space and books and neighbors who lent what they could. He split rails and tended a farm, chores that taught steady effort and thrift. Then, by lamplight or fireplace, he read until sleep dragged him away. That combination of hard, physical labor and quiet, studious nights shaped a mind that was practical but hungry for ideas. He loved the Bible and turned to it not just for faith but as a source of language and moral stories, the kind you can use to explain a point to someone at a kitchen table. Shakespeare was another constant companion. Lincoln borrowed phrases and images from those plays the way a storyteller borrows a colorful hat, to make a point and to keep people listening. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and collections of fables, like Aesop's, showed up in his reading too, providing simple stories with clear lessons. Those books taught him metaphor and moral clarity, tools he used whether he was arguing a case or telling a joke. Practical texts mattered as well. He read law books and newspapers, and he picked up the rules of argument and the habit of weighing evidence. Think of it as learning the rules of a game by watching others play and then trying a few moves himself. When he needed to argue a legal point, he could do it in plain language that ordinary people could understand, not because he wanted to be simple, but because he believed clarity was the most honest way to communicate. That directness came from reading difficult texts until their ideas became ordinary speech. Everyday examples show how those influences worked in life. He would sit and read by the fire, then stand up and tell the whole family a version of what he'd just read, trimming the hard parts or throwing in a folk joke so listeners stayed awake. He borrowed books from neighbors and sometimes walked long distances to get a new one, the sort of determination people often show when they're chasing a favorite hobby today. And humor was part of the package. He could quote a line from Shakespeare and follow it with a country joke, which made his points land without feeling like a lecture. In the end, those early influences, hard work, a patchwork education, the Bible's cadence, Shakespeare's imagery, simple moral tales, and practical law reading, combined to shape a voice that was earnest, witty, and persuasive. They also fed a habit that many of us will recognize, reading not just to impress others, but to think better, to explain more clearly, and sometimes to find a line that makes a room laugh. That mix of seriousness and small, human humor made his words stick, because they came from someone who had read widely and lived plainly. From rail splitter to rising lawyer. During the 19th century, a lanky youth on the American frontier learned to split rails for fences, a practical task that paid the bills and taught endurance. He worked with an axe from dawn until his hands ached, helping neighbors keep livestock in and wild animals out. These were ordinary chores that made his body strong and his mind plain. Life on the frontier offered very little in the way of formal schooling, so daily work and a keen curiosity became his teachers. A simple household fix, like shoring up a sagging fence, was as instructive to him as a textbook, and those hands-on lessons later showed up in the straightforward way he handled legal problems. He taught himself the law in much the same practical fashion that he had learned to split wood, by doing the work and by reading everything he could borrow. Instead of attending a formal law school, he read legal books and grew familiar with statutes and common-sense principles. This was a common route then, similar to learning a trade from a seasoned craftsman. Friends and established lawyers in his town encouraged and guided him, and eventually he began to take cases. Picture someone today fixing a car after sleepless nights with repair manuals and asking neighbors for tips. That combination of grit and plain study describes his legal education. In court he relied on clarity rather than fancy phrases. Complex property disputes, contract quarrels, and criminal defenses were all broken down with everyday comparisons that jurors could grasp. He enjoyed telling short stories or drawing simple analogies. they eased the tension in the room and helped jurors see the human side of a legal issue. Partners he worked with helped broaden his practice and reputation, and his honesty, often called his defining trait, made clients trust him even when money was scarce. He traveled long distances to reach circuit courts, sometimes by horseback, and argued cases across many counties. That steady presence, combined with careful preparation, built a rising legal voice. As his practice grew, ordinary townspeople began to turn to him for help with stubborn, practical problems, boundary lines that split farms, debts that threatened families, and contracts that read like gobbledygook to the common man. He approached each with a craftsman's patience and a storyteller's clarity, taking time to make the law understandable. A little humor crept into his courtroom manner too, not to lessen the matter, but to make it human, and that mixture of plain speech, steady work ethic, and a knack for explaining difficult ideas helped carry him from the world of split rails into the respect of the legal community. Courtroom theater and rhetorical craft. During his years traveling the Illinois circuit, Abraham Lincoln shaped a legal style that was as much theater as it was law. He was largely self-taught and worked with partners like John T. Stewart, Stephen T. Logan, and William H. Herndon while appearing in county courts and state appellate benches. Those experiences taught him that persuasion depends on more than rules on a page. He used plain language so jurors who had never seen a law book could follow the story of a case. Simple words, clear images, and a steady rhythm did more for him than jargon ever could. He treated a courtroom like a small stage where facts needed context and faces needed familiarity. Rather than unloading a pile of legal citations, he would organize evidence into a narrative arc, beginning, middle, and end. Jurors and judges could then see not just events, but motives and consequences. When a witness hesitated, Lincoln often replied with a quiet, pointed question that steered the moment back to clarity. He spoke in ways people use every day, telling about neighbors, farms, debts, businesses, so complex legal points felt ordinary and understandable. Humor showed up at the right moments too, a quick joke to loosen a tense room. It wasn't clowning. It was timing. His rhetorical toolbox was practical and easy to explain. He relied on analogies to turn abstract law into household scenes. A technical dispute became as simple as two neighbors arguing over a fence. He used repetition to hammer home a central fact, then contrasted that fact with an obvious truth to highlight inconsistency. Ethos, or building trust, mattered. His honesty and calm voice established credibility before any legal theory was introduced. Pathos, or appealing to emotion, arrived not as melodrama but as carefully chosen human details, how a law affected a family's bread or a widow's security. Logos, plain reasoning, tied it all together. Think of it like persuading a friend where you first show you understand their situation, then tell a concise story, and finally make a clear ask. Same method. Different stakes. Everyday examples show how his methods translate now. A teacher explaining a tricky concept will pause, give a short everyday example, then repeat the key point. Sound familiar? A manager persuading a team uses the same arc: state the problem, tell a quick story of impact, then propose the solution. Lincoln's courtroom way also advised on posture: listen more than you speak, let pauses do the convincing, and avoid pretending to be cleverer than your audience. He often accepted non-cash payment and handled many different types of cases, which grounded him socially and made his arguments more relatable. That down-to-earth quality was persuasive in a courtroom full of ordinary people. Practical tips borrowed directly from his playbook. First, simplify. Translate technical terms into everyday language, like turning contractual breach into a promise someone didn't keep. Second, use a short, memorable story to frame the facts. Third, cultivate calmness. A steady voice and a brief smile can do more than a volley of words. And finally, practice honesty. Credibility is earned slowly but lost instantly. A little humor helps, but keep it gentle. Think of it as seasoning, not the main course. Lincoln's courtroom theater reminds us that law is human work, and rhetoric is best when it teaches, persuades, and respects the people listening. Entering politics, State House to Congress. During the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln moved from a life shaped by the frontier and the law into steady work in the Illinois state legislature, and those years taught him how politics actually operated. He won his first election to the Illinois General Assembly in 1834 and went on to serve 4 successive terms, using that time to learn procedure, craft laws, and practice speaking to ordinary voters. In Springfield he kept a law office and practiced on the circuit, which meant traveling from county to argue cases. This practical mix of work and public service grounded his politics in everyday concerns. He was a member of the Whig Party then, which meant he favored internal improvements, roads, bridges and canals, and a strong role for government in promoting commerce, not because he loved bureaucracy but because he wanted tangible benefits for farmers and merchants who depended on good routes to market. In the State House he became known for plain language and a habit of telling stories to make a point. People remembered him for clear, down-to-earth speeches rather than fancy rhetoric. One example, when debating a bill about roads, he compared a public project to fixing the single plank on a muddy path so a neighbor could get his cart through. Simple, practical, and it made the idea stick. He also wrote and delivered the Lyceum Address in 1838, a speech that combined a moral appeal with civic advice and showed he could step beyond narrow local issues to talk about law and order and the responsibilities of citizens. That speech helped shape his public identity as someone serious about the rule of law, not merely a local advocate for this or that contract. The jump to national politics came when he ran for the United States House of Representatives and won a single term, serving in the 30th Congress. Washington did not immediately enchant him. He found the capital's social whirl and backroom bargaining awkward and often at odds with his Midwestern straightforwardness. Once in Congress he opposed the Mexican-American War on principle, arguing that it was an unjust conflict likely aimed at extending slavery's reach. He also supported such things as government investment in infrastructure and the creation of a national bank, positions consistent with his Whig background, while voting in ways that reflected both conscience and careful calculation about what would help his constituents back home. He chose not to seek a second term, partly because the life of a national politician did not suit his temperament and partly because he preferred the steady work and income of his law practice. Back in Illinois he resumed practicing law, where arguing cases in small courthouses kept him in touch with the people who elected him. For everyday perspective, constituents expected help with land disputes, estate paperwork, or simple legal guidance, and Lincoln handled such matters while remaining a public figure who could lecture on civic virtue one week and settle a boundary quarrel the next. He kept using humor to diffuse tensions in court, an occasional dry witticism or a homespun analogy, and that made him approachable, which in turn helped build the trust that would support him later when bigger issues demanded national attention. Whig convictions and political experiments. During the 19th century Abraham Lincoln found a political home in the Whig Party because its program matched the kind of practical progress he wanted for a growing nation. He embraced the Whig emphasis on modernizing the economy, things like better roads, canals, railroads, and a stable banking system, and he admired leaders who argued for those ideas, especially Henry Clay. Lincoln's time as a Whig lawmaker meant pushing for tangible improvements that people could see and use, not just abstract promises. Think of him backing a new bridge or a road that would let farmers get corn to market faster. He carried those convictions into public office. Before his later national fame, Lincoln served multiple terms in his state legislature and then a single term in the U.S. House of Representatives as a Whig, where he was both practical and outspoken. In Congress he challenged his party's opponents when he thought they were wrong. One famous example was his insistence on questioning the reasons for going to war, through what were called spot resolutions. That kind of sharp questioning sounds a bit like asking for a receipt at a restaurant when the bill doesn't add up. He wanted exact facts, not vague claims. Lincoln's Whig outlook also shaped his approach to slavery and social policy, but in a cautionary, pragmatic way rather than a purely ideological one. He opposed the spread of slavery into new territories while often stopping short of urging immediate abolition everywhere, and for a time he supported colonization, the idea of encouraging freed black people to settle elsewhere. To modern ears that sounds odd, and it was an uneasy mix of principle and political calculation. He treated slavery as a moral problem that had to be restrained and, where possible, remedied through legal and institutional means rather than abrupt social upheaval. Experimentation was part of his political DNA. He tried different rhetorical styles, built unlikely coalitions, and learned to balance moral language with policy detail. In town meetings and courtrooms he practiced telling stories that made complicated points simple, a useful tool for persuading farmers and shopkeepers. For example, advocating a tariff to protect local industry is as relatable as convincing a neighborhood to support a new factory that brings jobs. Both require explaining benefits in everyday terms and showing how broader choices affect local lives. He also tested the boundaries of party loyalty when circumstances demanded it. As Whig cohesion weakened, Lincoln began working across lines, meeting with former opponents and newer political allies to form a broader front against slavery's expansion. That willingness to experiment, to mix caution with conviction, to switch tactics without surrendering core beliefs, helped him navigate volatile politics. A little humor fit into that toolbox too. He could diffuse tensions with a dry joke, which is often a better strategy than shouting at a meeting, and it made him approachable to people who feared high-minded politicians. In practical terms, the Whig phase left a clear legacy. Lincoln learned to value economic tools as instruments of social improvement, to demand clear evidence from those in power, and to build pragmatic alliances that could turn ideas into roads, banks, schools, and laws. Those are the kinds of results that ordinary citizens notice, not just speeches. His Whig convictions weren't just theory on a page, they were everyday politics: the push to fix a muddy road, to fund a schoolhouse, to question a dubious war order, and those concrete efforts shaped how he later led on much larger stages. The rise of the Republican movement. During the mid-1800s, American politics were in motion, and new forces pushed old alliances apart. Tensions over slavery, economic interests, and westward expansion made existing parties uneasy, and people who wanted change found themselves forming new connections. The result was a political movement built from many smaller groups: activists who opposed the spread of slavery into new territories, former Whigs who disliked their party's drift, free soilers who insisted land should be for free laborers, and reform-minded Democrats who wanted a different national direction. These groups did not always agree on everything, but they shared enough common ground to cooperate. Many local meetings and conventions stitched these strands together. Picture a town hall where neighbors heatedly debate a single issue and then start organizing petitions and rallies. That is how the movement grew, one community at a time. Grassroots organizing mattered more than dazzling speeches. People wrote letters, printed pamphlets, and held neighborhood gatherings. Ordinary citizens did the day-to-day work that turned scattered frustration into a recognizable force. It's similar to how a neighborhood cleanup can become a citywide movement when enough people care. A central idea that united the movement was opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories. In simple terms, many supporters believed that allowing slavery to spread would limit opportunities for free laborers, small farmers, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs who wanted a fair chance to succeed. Think of it like someone blocking a shared alleyway so neighbors can't bring out their carts. It harms the whole block's ability to get by. This stance was more about where slavery could exist than an immediate demand to abolish it everywhere, which helped bring together moderates and activists who might not otherwise cooperate. Leadership emerged from this coalition naturally, through debates, speeches, and political contests. Abraham Lincoln stood out in part because he could explain complex questions in plain language. He used stories and everyday comparisons to reach people who were skeptical of abstract philosophy. His platform emphasized free labor and the idea that the nation should remain a place where a person could work, save, and rise through effort. That message resonated with farmers and shopkeepers who feared economic systems that favored a few at the expense of many. Organizationally, the movement borrowed techniques from both older parties and newer reform efforts. There were disciplined local committees, coordinated state meetings, and a growing ability to communicate across regions. Volunteers learned how to mobilize voters, print persuasive material, and use rallies to build momentum. A little humor helped too. Cartoons and witty pamphlets made serious matters easier to discuss around kitchen tables. In the end it was practical work, steady persuasion, coalition building, and clear messaging, that turned scattered sympathies into a coherent political force. Lincoln and slavery, moral calculations. During the 19th century Abraham Lincoln called slavery morally wrong, and he said so in ways both plain and careful. He drew on the Declaration of Independence's idea that people are equal and used it to frame slavery as an injustice, not merely a political inconvenience. In speeches he insisted that slavery could not permanently survive where it did not spread, but he also spoke like a lawyer and a politician, weighing what the Constitution permitted and what a fragile union could bear. His language was moral, his tactics were calculated. He balanced ideals against immediate realities in ways that sometimes look strange to modern eyes. For example, he supported compensated emancipation, in which slaveholders would be paid to free enslaved people, a practical proposal meant to make abolition less disruptive. Compensated emancipation sounds like a compromise. It's simply paying someone to change a harmful practice, like offering a buyout to close a noisy factory rather than shutting it down overnight. He also entertained colonization proposals, meaning relocation of freed people to colonies abroad, because he worried about social tensions if millions of emancipated people had nowhere safe to go. That idea was offensive to many black leaders and activists, who argued that the United States was their home and that pushing them out was another form of injustice. Frederick Douglass, for instance, pushed back hard in meetings with Lincoln. Those conversations nudged the president's thinking over time. When the country went to war, Lincoln's moral reasoning shifted into wartime strategy. He framed emancipation as a military necessity in the parts of the Confederacy he could reach, using presidential war powers to free enslaved people in rebelling areas while withholding that measure from border states that had stayed in the Union. It was a hard-edged decision that mixed moral aim with military calculus, weakening the enemy's labor force, bolstering Union ranks with black soldiers, and signaling a higher purpose for the fight. Think of it like a coach who changes the game plan not only to win but also to make a statement about the kind of team they want to be. The Emancipation Proclamation was an unmistakable moral line and a practical tool at once. Over time his private views and public policies edged closer together. Lincoln came to support permanent, national abolition through constitutional change. He pushed for measures that would end slavery throughout the country and, by the end of his life, even suggested limited voting rights for educated black men and veterans, a sign that his moral calculus was evolving beyond containment toward fuller inclusion. His route was uneven, driven by legal caution, political reality, military strategy, and personal growth. In ordinary terms, he was a man trying to do what was right without collapsing the very nation that might make that right real, like someone trying to steer a creaky ship away from a storm while patching holes and convincing the crew it's worth the risk. A little awkward, sometimes painfully slow, but significant in its eventual direction. Debates with Douglass, a national laboratory. During the Illinois senatorial campaign of 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas met in 7 public debates that traveled from town to town across the state. They agreed on a strict speaking format. One candidate spoke for an hour, the other answered for 90 minutes, then the first had a half-hour reply. Crowds came by the thousands to hear them, and newspaper printers rushed to set the speeches in type so people far away could read every word. The scene was part political contest and part public classroom, a place where big national questions were tested in front of ordinary listeners. Lincoln used these encounters to argue that slavery should not spread into new territories, and he framed that position in moral, plain language that people could picture at their kitchen tables. Douglas countered with the idea called popular sovereignty, letting the people who lived in a territory decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Think of it like two neighbors arguing whether a new fence should be installed. One says, "Let the whole block vote," and the other says, "But what if your vote lets my yard get ruined?" The debates turned abstract constitutional and moral questions into stories and examples that people could relate to immediately. One important moment came when Douglas explained how local decisions could work in practice, a position later labeled the Freeport Doctrine. He said that even if courts ruled a certain way, local people could effectively prevent slavery by refusing to pass laws that protected it, or by not enforcing laws that would make it possible. In simple terms, law sometimes depends on the willingness of people nearby to make it real. Lincoln seized on that tension between legal rulings and everyday practice, pointing out that rights written on paper need social will and habit to become living things. It is like owning a recipe, it only becomes a meal when someone goes into the kitchen and cooks. Reporters and editors treated the debates as experiments in persuasion, noting which arguments landed and which fizzled. Political leaders watched too, learning how different appeals worked in small towns versus larger cities. Lincoln refined his use of moral imagery and concise, repeatable lines that could be carried on handbills and quoted in newspapers. Douglas relied on quick rebuttals and a reputation for clarity about local control. The exchanges functioned much like a national laboratory for public opinion. Ideas were tried in public, observed, measured by applause and newspaper reprints, and then adjusted. Everyday examples help make that clearer. A candidate testing a new slogan is like a baker trying a tweak to a recipe and watching which customers come back for more. Some changes are small, like adjusting the spice. Some are big, like changing the whole cake. The debates showed which flavors of argument appealed across a wide range of people, and which appealed only to a narrow corner. A bit of humor crept in, too. Lincoln's dry wit could cut through a long legal point, and Douglas could turn a complicated constitutional theory into a folk reason that sounded almost practical. In the end, the debates did something beyond choosing a senator. They sharpened public language and taught politicians how to communicate to a nation that was listening closely. Campaign trails, data, rhetoric, and audience. When Abraham Lincoln walked a campaign trail, he treated information like a map and stories like the compass. He paid attention to vote returns, newspaper reports, and letters from local organizers to know where support was strong or weak. Those bits of information functioned as early campaign data, simple numbers from previous contests, lists of friendly editors, and reports from precinct captains who could tell him whether a county liked his tone or his rival's promises. In practical terms, think of it as checking customer reviews and sales receipts before opening a shop in a new neighborhood. You want to know who's buying and why. Lincoln matched that practical data gathering with a rhetoric that was plain, precise, and often wry. He avoided lofty jargon when a short story would do. He could explain a legal point with a single folk image and then loosen a room with a self-deprecating joke about his height or his stovepipe hat. That kind of plain speaking made complex ideas feel manageable. Rhetoric here means the tools he used: stories, contrasts, questions, and humor, and he picked the simplest tool that would work for a given crowd. For example, in formal debate settings he used careful logic and step-by-step argumentation. At county fairs and small meetings he switched to anecdotes and local references that listeners could instantly relate to. Audience awareness guided where and how he spoke. Farmers wanted reassurance that markets and roads would improve. Lawyers and merchants wanted clarity on contracts and economic policy. Ministers and moral leaders listened for moral framing. He learned to adapt. Short, direct appeals for unity resonated in towns worried about conflict. Longer, detailed expositions were reserved for newspapers and debates where readers and better-informed listeners expected nuance. A modern parallel would be writing a precise, sourced op-ed for serious outlets while posting a short, friendly video to reach casual followers. Both modes matter. Both reach different kinds of people. Campaign logistics and media amplified the effort. Trains and newspapers shortened the time between towns and headlines, and local editors functioned like neighborhood influencers. Pamphlets, broadsides, and songs spread slogans and images, while local party committees organized meetings and arranged who would introduce the candidate. In practical modern terms, think of it as combining targeted email lists, coordinated social posts, and trusted community messengers. Lincoln's campaign life shows a simple lesson: gather reliable local reports, tailor your tone to the room, and use every channel available to reinforce the same core message. He trusted stories to translate policy into feeling, and he trusted data to tell him where to tell them. Short speeches could win over a tavern crowd. Long arguments could win over the press. Humor smoothed tensions, and plain language prevented misunderstandings. Those combined skills, attention to facts on the ground, flexible rhetorical tools, and a clear sense of audience, offer a practical blueprint for anyone wanting to communicate effectively today, whether running for office, selling a product, or simply trying to convince the neighbors to support a community project. The 1860 election and a fractured union. During the mid-19th century, the national conversation had hardened into two loud camps: those who wanted to stop the spread of slavery into new territories and those who feared any move that might weaken the system they depended on. Abraham Lincoln emerged as the Republican nominee who argued that slavery should not expand into new states, while promising not to immediately abolish it where it already existed. He was a practical man from Illinois who had earned attention through debates and speeches. Many people knew him as plain-spoken and stubbornly honest, which helped him connect with voters in the North. Other candidates split the opposition, with rival Democrats running separate campaigns and a third-party candidate appealing to moderates who wanted to avoid taking a clear stand on slavery. The way the votes broke down looked less like a clean choice and more like a crowded crossroads. With the opposition divided, Lincoln could win a majority of the electoral contests in the North even though many Southerners never saw his name on their ballots. Think of it like a neighborhood potluck where three friends insist on bringing similar casseroles. The person who brings something different ends up with most of the compliments. This division amplified regional tensions because Southerners felt their political influence was slipping away, and many leaders saw Lincoln's victory as proof that they would soon be boxed out of national decisions about slavery and trade. Secession, a word that means a state decides to leave the United States, followed quickly in some quarters. People used everyday terms to explain it. One state pulled its membership card out of a club it had joined, declaring the club no longer represented its needs. That's a simple way to picture political withdrawal, though the reality was dangerous and complicated. When a state abandons shared institutions like currency, military arrangements, and legal commitments, normal business becomes messy and trust evaporates, much like partners splitting a company without agreeing on who gets what equipment or which clients to keep. Lincoln's public stance added to the stress even as he tried to calm fears. He insisted that the Union must be preserved and that the Constitution provided pathways to manage disagreements. At the same time, he made clear he would not promote the expansion of slavery, a position that reassured many Northerners but terrified many Southerners. Everyday life examples help. If a town votes to ban a polluting factory from expanding, some residents cheer and others fear losing jobs. Everyone interprets the change through their own lens of livelihood and principle. That mixture of principle and practical worries turned political disagreement into a national crisis. The immediate aftermath taught a hard lesson about political fragmentation. When parties split and leaders cannot find common ground, institutions meant to bridge differences can fail. It's a reminder that politics is not just about winning but about managing the consequences of victory. A lesson for modern times too: alliances and compromise matter, because when they break down, ordinary people pay the price. Families, businesses, and local communities can feel the shock in the simplest ways, like a sudden shortage of goods or the loss of a paycheck. A little humor helps the memory. Politics can be like a game of musical chairs where someone forgot to stop the music, and everyone rushes for the seats at once. Presidential humor, humility, and tough choices. During the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln used plain speech and a ready story to reach listeners, and he did so on purpose. He told jokes and short, self-deprecating tales, not to distract, but to make complicated or painful topics feel human and understandable. In public and in private, he favored small, vivid anecdotes over abstract lectures. A long speech might be punctuated by a short, witty line that made people laugh and then think. That laugh was a tool. It opened ears, softened anger, and reminded friends and foes alike that the man speaking belonged to the same messy, worried world as they did. He carried a humility that came from growing up with little formal schooling and learning by reading and arguing his way into the law. This humility showed itself in practical ways. He listened more than he lectured, he admitted errors when he believed he had made them, and he treated sharp critics with a mixture of patience and plain talk. Rather than surrounding himself only with yes-men, he invited hard voices into his inner circle, choosing competence and honest counsel over flattery. If you think of a modern workplace, it's like a CEO hiring capable rivals to lead departments because their strengths matter more than grudges. The choice is practical and often unpopular, but it keeps the whole enterprise functioning. The toughest decisions he faced forced him to balance moral aims against immediate danger, and he never pretended those balances were simple. One example of a hard measure was the use of extraordinary legal powers to keep the country together when rebellion threatened public safety. In plain terms, that meant temporarily allowing arrests without the usual immediate court review, a step taken because the government believed quick action was necessary to prevent chaos. Another agonizing choice was using wartime authority to free people held as slaves in rebellious regions, an order intended as both a moral act and a wartime strategy that would weaken the enemy and change the stakes of the conflict. He also struggled with military leadership, changing commanders until he found officers whose plans could actually win battles. Each decision carried costs, dissent at home, strained alliances, and the chance of failing to hold the Union together at all. Humor and humility worked together as protective habits when choices were brutal. A quick joke could relieve tension in a staff meeting before someone announced a painful policy. A humble tone could make a harsh decision easier to accept, because people felt heard even if they were not pleased. Think of a parent who must discipline a child but also explain the reason patiently. The punishment stings less when delivered with care and a touch of lightness. In Lincoln's case, those qualities did not soften the gravity of his responsibilities, but they did make his leadership bearable to others and, importantly, sustainable. He showed that a leader can be warm without being weak, honest about limits without giving up authority, and willing to shoulder unpopular choices while keeping a human face on power. War presidency, strategy, logistics, and science. Lincoln treated the presidency like the head of a giant, stubborn workshop where military plans had to serve political goals and real people. He stepped into strategy debates with generals who had far more battlefield experience than he did, but he insisted that campaigns be coordinated and that the aim remain to preserve the Union. He often pushed for offensives rather than long waits for perfect conditions, clashing with cautious commanders who preferred to train and hold back. One clear example of that tension was his frequent friction with George B. McClellan, whose cautious approach tested Lincoln's patience and forced him to weigh when to press a reluctant general and when to replace him. Behind every campaign lay a mountain of supplies and routes that had to be kept open. Railroads became the arteries of war, carrying food, ammunition, and fresh troops. Keeping them working was as important as winning a single battle. Montgomery C. Meigs, for instance, built an efficient supply system, warehouses, depots, and block trains, that kept armies fed and armed. Think of it like planning a cross-country move for an army. You must book trucks, label boxes, and make sure the fragile china doesn't get tossed out first. Short-term victories mean little if the troops starve or the ammunition runs out. Lincoln understood that and pressured his subordinates to think in terms of logistics as much as maneuvers. New tools and scientific thinking altered how wars were fought, and Lincoln welcomed those changes. The telegraph turned the War Department into a real-time operations center, allowing him to read dispatches and send orders quickly, almost like early instant messaging. Observation balloons were used to watch enemy positions from above. They were slow and a bit windy, but they gave commanders useful eyes in the sky. On the water, ironclad ships designed by innovators such as John Ericsson showed that engineering could decide naval supremacy. These armored vessels were not sailing boats in fancy coats, they were working machines built to shrug off cannonballs. Medical care also moved from Anno Domini hoc tending by neighbors to organized ambulance systems and better hospital management, changes led by people such as Jonathan Letterman and aided by volunteer groups like the United States Sanitary Commission. These practical steps saved many lives. Think of reorganizing a neighborhood first aid kit into a small clinic. Lincoln did not simply delegate these areas and walk away. He read technical reports, questioned inventors and engineers, and visited battlefields to see logistics and science in action. He trusted and relied on expert advisors, cabinet officers, quartermasters, engineers, and medical directors, but he also made the hard choices when plans failed. In a way, he ran the national effort like a CEO facing a crisis, juggling strategy, keeping the supply lines humming, and betting on new technology when it promised an edge. He kept a sense of humor about it sometimes, reminding people that while he might not be a trained soldier or a naval architect, he could learn fast and ask the right questions. The result was a presidency that blended practical management, evolving science, and hands-on strategy into a single, complicated task. Emancipation Proclamation as policy experiment. During the Civil War, Lincoln treated emancipation as a tool of policy as much as a moral statement, using his powers as commander-in-chief to target slavery where it would most damage the Confederacy. He did not issue a blanket, immediate freedom for every enslaved person everywhere. Instead, the proclamation applied to those territories in active rebellion and left slavery intact in loyal border states and in areas already under Union control. This was a deliberate choice, grounded in law and wartime authority, meant to weaken the enemy while trying to keep fragile Union support intact. The document was a presidential action, not a law passed by Congress, so its practical force depended on the reach of federal arms and administration. Seen as a policy experiment, the proclamation tested several levers at once: military strategy, diplomacy, and social change. It allowed the Union to recruit formerly enslaved men into its armies and navies, which changed military manpower and morale. Roughly 180,000 African American soldiers and sailors served by the end of the conflict. Enforcement relied on Union advances. Wherever armies moved, enslaved people could seek freedom and, in many cases, organize their own departure from bondage. Think of it like a city council rolling out a pilot program in one neighborhood to see how trash collection changes work before applying them citywide. There was measurement, adjustment, and learning in real time. The proclamation also played a diplomatic role and was deliberately designed with that in mind. By framing emancipation as a war measure against rebellion, Lincoln made the Confederacy's cause harder to defend abroad, especially in countries that had outlawed slavery. That diplomatic pressure helped reduce the chance of formal recognition by major European powers. Domestically, the step shifted the war's purpose in public view from solely preserving the Union to also weakening the institution of slavery. This change enlarged the stakes and created both support and fierce opposition. Lincoln balanced pressure from radical abolitionists who wanted faster, broader change with political realities in border states that he could not alienate. Lincoln's approach included other experimental elements, like proposals for compensated emancipation and for encouraging voluntary resettlement of freed people, ideas he pursued quietly when he thought they might ease the transition. Those plans met resistance and were not universally adopted, illustrating how an experimental policy can encounter limits in practice. At the local level, formerly enslaved people often formed new communities, sought wages, reunited families, and pushed for education. These outcomes were not guaranteed by proclamation alone and required follow-up policies and social adjustments. It was not an instant fix, rather, it set a new direction and revealed what further steps would be necessary. Viewed from a policy lens, the proclamation was neither purely symbolic nor purely practical. It was a calculated experiment with broad human consequences. It changed legal status in certain areas, shifted military resources, and altered international calculations, while also forcing Americans to confront the messy realities of freedom on the ground. Small everyday comparisons help. It's like a school principal instituting a gradual change in discipline to see how students respond, then refining the approach, or a chef tweaking a recipe and asking the staff to taste before serving it to guests. A little humor helps keep the drama human. Lincoln, famously cautious and thoughtful, was more the careful cook than the impulsive chef, testing, tasting, and adjusting until the policy fit the menu of war, law, and conscience. Speeches as experiments in persuasion. During the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln treated public speaking like a laboratory for ideas, testing different tones, lengths, and stories to see what moved a crowd. He composed many of his own speeches and deliberately changed his approach depending on audience and purpose. One moment he would argue in tight, lawyerly logic, the next he would hand listeners a short, poetic sentence that lodged in the mind like a pebble in a shoe. This is why some of his addresses are remembered for tight constitutional reasoning, while others are remembered for lines like, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," or the compact, resonant closing of Gettysburg that speaks of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. He mixed plain talk with moral force, aiming to win trust before trying to change a belief. In simple terms, first make people feel you know what you're talking about, then make them care, and finally give them reasons to act. Those three moves, trust, feeling, and reason, are what speech experts call ethos, pathos, and logos, but there's nothing mystical about them. A parent convincing a child to wear a coat might start by saying, "First know this cold bites, trust," then recall a story of shivering on a bus, feeling, and finish with the practical step, "Put it on and keep your mittens." Lincoln often layered his speeches the same way. He also experimented with form. Sometimes he wrote long, careful expositions that read more like legal briefs, aimed at persuading educated audiences through history and precedent. Other times he stripped language down to almost biblical cadence, trusting that a few well-chosen words would reach people's hearts. The contrast between those approaches is instructive for anyone trying to persuade today. If you prepare a long slide deck for a team meeting and see eyes glaze, it may be time to switch to one clear sentence and a short, memorable example. Lincoln's shifts were deliberate. He learned where a slow, reasoned build-up worked and where a single, lyrical sentence would create the emotional lift needed. Repetition and contrast were favorite tools. Short clauses piled against short clauses can feel like a drumbeat and make ideas stick. That's why lines such as, "with malice toward none, with charity for all," hit so hard. Each short phrase lands and then the next answers it. Using opposite ideas, known as antithesis, made his points vivid. Instead of saying, "We should be fair," he showed fairness by placing two ideas side by side and letting listeners feel the tension. In everyday life, it's the same trick when you say, "First am not angry, first am disappointed," people notice the shift and it sharpens your message. A bit of well-timed self-deprecating humor, Lincoln often joked about his plainness, also lowered defenses. Humor works like a spoonful of sugar, it doesn't replace the medicine, but it helps swallow it. He tested different emotional appeals too. Lincoln could summon legal history to convince lawyers and judges, and then pivot to moral imagery when speaking to farmers or soldiers. That flexible targeting is what persuasion looks like in real-world terms. Adjust your language and examples to match the experience of your listeners. Think of trying to persuade a neighbor to support a community garden. One approach is to present zoning laws and property benefits, another is to talk about the taste of fresh tomatoes or the laugh of a child picking beans. Try one, watch reactions, then try the other. Lincoln watched crowds and read replies. He revised his texts because he wanted to see which version moved people to think differently or act. The practical lesson he offers is straightforward: treat speeches as experiments, not decrees. Write a draft, test a tone, swap a long paragraph for a one-line truth, and notice which lines people repeat afterward. You might fail sometimes, Lincoln certainly did, and he learned from it, but small, careful adjustments often have outsized results. Think of persuasion like cooking. Sometimes you need a long, slow simmer, sometimes the dish needs only a quick pinch of salt. Lincoln's habit of trying different recipes, paying attention, and returning to refine his message made him an unusually effective persuader, patient and practical in equal measure. Cabinet chemistry, managing strong minds. Abraham Lincoln deliberately gathered a cabinet made up of strong, sometimes abrasive, but talented political rivals, believing that talent and honest disagreement would produce the best decisions for the nation. Men like William Seward at the State Department and Salmon P. Chase at the Treasury had large egos and clear ambitions, and others such as Edwin Stanton would later run military affairs with an iron hand. Lincoln did not seek calm homogeneity, he sought mind-forcing sparks, and he managed them in ways that turned potential chaos into practical governance. He listened more than he lectured, which was unusual for a leader facing constant crises. Instead of browbeating dissenters, he invited their blunt assessments and then deliberated quietly on the merits of each argument. When Seward pushed firmly on foreign policy matters, Lincoln let him take the lead there, when Stanton demanded control over military logistics, Lincoln gave him authority while retaining ultimate responsibility. That balance, clear lines of responsibility paired with a leader's willingness to take the final call, is a simple management trick anyone can use today. Lincoln used humor and humility to lower the temperature in a room. He told short, self-deprecating stories that made opponents laugh and remember they were working toward a common goal, not vying for personal victory. He also handled grudges in private, preferring one-on-one conversations to public rebukes. This kept arguments from becoming permanent ruptures. There was a famous moment when he resisted calls to remove a fierce minister, reportedly saying he couldn't spare a man who fought, a reminder that a combative ally can be more useful than a meek yes-man. Practical lessons for modern teams flow directly from these historical choices. Assign roles that match people's strengths, encourage frank debate but require decisions, and resolve personal conflicts privately. During a heated team meeting, for instance, pull the two loudest voices into a separate conversation and ask them to outline solutions rather than trade insults. Praise competence publicly and curb petty rivalries quietly. Use light humor to diffuse tension. A short, well-timed joke can turn a shouting match into a brainstorming session. Concrete, everyday examples help make this actionable. At the office, let your strongest-willed product manager own prioritization while giving the engineer autonomy on technical choices. At home, if two siblings argue over chores, assign them complementary tasks and ask each to be responsible for one shared outcome. Small rituals also work. A brief, candid check-in every Monday prevents resentment from building, much like Lincoln's habit of reading and weighing opinions before acting. A little patience, a good ear, and the courage to let capable people compete can turn a volatile group into an effective team. Military leadership and strategic trials. During the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln found himself thrust into the role of commander-in-chief without the usual military resume. He had served briefly as a militia officer in his younger days, but that was not the same as running an army, and he knew it. Rather than pretending to be a field general, he read military manuals, talked to career officers, and learned on the job, like a manager who takes evening classes while running a struggling company. He asked questions, listened, and slowly developed a sense of how to turn political power into battlefield advantage. He faced a string of strategic tests that were both practical and human. Some of his earliest generals showed talent but not the willingness to press their advantage, others were bold but unreliable. Lincoln had to judge character as much as competence. He complained famously about one commander's reluctance by quipping that if the general did not want to use the army he would like to borrow it for a while. That bit of impatience came from a deep need to see momentum converted into results. In the same way a coach replaces a timid player with someone who will take a shot, Lincoln moved commanders in and out when hesitation or failure threatened the larger effort. Coordination was another constant headache. He learned to think beyond single battles and look at the whole map, rail lines, rivers, ports, and the movement of men and supplies. A blockade, for instance, is like closing the doors to a kitchen so nobody can bring in food. It sounds simple, but maintaining that closure across a long coastline takes ships, men, and patience. Lincoln worked with naval officers and Western commanders, trying to align separate campaigns so they would squeeze the enemy from different sides. That idea of simultaneous pressure required trust in subordinates, and he had to balance that trust against political realities and public expectations. Telegraph wires became one of his new tools. He read dispatches and answered them from the Capitol, sometimes late into the night. That made him unusually hands-on for a president. He could nudge a campaign, urge caution, or press a pursuit. He also kept a weather eye on morale, knowing that public support was a resource as real as soldiers. The move to allow formerly enslaved people to join the armies, for example, had both moral and practical dimensions. It bolstered manpower and weakened the enemy's labor base. Decisions like that were not purely military, they were strategic choices at the intersection of war and politics. Failures taught him as much as successes. When a commander underestimated an opponent or failed to follow through after a hard-fought victory, Lincoln felt the sting and adjusted. He could be impatient, yes, but he could also be patient when the situation required long, grinding pressure, what generals call attrition, which simply means wearing down the opponent by constant pressure. Think of it like shrinking a stubborn pile of laundry by doing a little every day rather than trying to finish it all at once. That steady persistence would later pay off when he backed leaders who combined endurance with aggression. In choosing his final military leadership, he picked men who were willing to press the fight and accept heavy costs, and he supported coordinated plans that attacked the enemy's strengths from multiple directions. He prized initiative and tenacity. His remarks about a later general, "First can't spare this man, he fights," show how Lincoln valued someone who would keep fighting even when the cost was high. Humble beginnings, careful study, and hard-earned judgment turned a politically skilled lawyer into a wartime leader who learned to use the instruments of modern warfare wisely, while still keeping a human touch and occasional wry comment to relieve the pressure. Homefront challenges and civil liberties. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln authorized extraordinary steps on the homefront that deeply tested civil liberties. He approved the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in certain places. In simple terms, that writ is the court order that makes authorities bring a detained person before a judge to explain why they are being held. Picture it like a rule that prevents someone being locked in a room forever without anyone saying why. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney challenged the president in a well-known legal opinion, arguing that only Congress could suspend that protection. Lincoln, however, treated the measure as a wartime necessity and allowed military authorities to detain suspected Confederate sympathizers without immediate judicial review. Military tribunals and the arrest of civilians became another flashpoint. Military courts tried some people instead of civilian courts, which meant different rules and fewer protections for defendants. Think of it as being called before the school principal rather than having a normal court judge. The process is quicker and harsher, and appeals are harder. Critics pointed to high-profile cases like the arrest and military trial of Clement Vallandigham, a vocal peace Democrat who was convicted by a military tribunal for his public speeches against the war and then exiled. Newspapers were not immune either. Editors who printed incendiary or defeatist material sometimes found presses interrupted, telegraph lines monitored, or staff arrested. That kind of censorship felt to many like the government reaching into everyday life and silencing voices it disliked. The draft added another layer of tension on the home front. Compulsory military service stirred resistance, especially among working-class communities who felt they were bearing the brunt of sacrifice while wealthier men could avoid service. When drafts were enforced in cities, unrest could and did turn violent, forcing the federal government to send troops to restore order. Families living on small wages worried about being left without support, and communities debated whether refusal to serve was a crime or an act of conscience. These were practical, heartbreaking dilemmas, and they made the question of how far a government should go in peacetime right suddenly very immediate. Lincoln defended many of these actions as necessary to preserve the Union and, he argued, the larger constitutional order. To him, saving the nation justified temporary, targeted restrictions. This stance set precedents about executive power during emergencies that later generations would study and contest. The trade-offs still feel familiar today. Think how airport security can slow you down and pat you down for the sake of safety, or how a city might close roads and seize property after a natural disaster. A little humor helps. It's a strange comfort to realize that Americans have long argued fiercely over personal liberty while simultaneously grumbling about being inconvenienced for the common good. The central lesson from Lincoln's homefront challenges is that emergency measures aimed at survival can protect a nation but also strain its principles, and judging that balance remains a civic duty. Personal loss, resilience, and character. He lost his mother when he was a child, and that first deep ache stayed with him like a permanent shadow. Later he endured other family deaths. Several of his young sons did not survive to adulthood, and those losses compounded rather than erased the earlier pain. Such repeated bereavement changed how he saw people. It deepened an ability to sympathize, and it made him more careful with words when speaking about suffering. Losing close relatives at vulnerable moments taught him what ordinary sorrow feels like, and that understanding found its way into both private letters and public decisions. Grief did not break him outright. Instead, It helped form a kind of steady endurance that showed up in everyday routines. He read and thought through hard times. Books and work became ballast. When a modern parent loses a child yet still shows up for work the next day, balancing duty and shattered feelings, that practical resilience is familiar, and visible in his life too. He turned to friends to talk things through, and he used humor to lift the mood in dark rooms. Jokes and stories were tools, not denials. A laugh could create breathing space for sorrow to be felt and then carried forward. That mixture of melancholy and wit shaped a distinctive moral character. He was known for plain speech and a habit of telling the truth even when it made things harder. People who worked with him often found him both stern about principles and oddly tender in private. He could scold with a phrase that stung, then follow it with a small kindness that made repair possible. In practical terms, that looked like listening to opponents, folding persuasive logic into polite treatment, and being willing to change course when conscience demanded it. Humility was part of the package. He never presented himself as infallible, and that honesty made others more willing to trust him. On a human level, the lessons are simple and useful today. Allow grief its time, but keep a tether to ordinary tasks, rely on close friends and faithful routines, use humor sparingly to relieve tension without minimizing pain. He showed how private losses can enlarge public compassion. Suffering need not harden the heart, it can open it. Small acts, writing a note, telling a careful joke, listening for a long minute, made a big difference in how he lived and led. That combination of loss, steady endurance, and clear-eyed decency is how his character came to feel both real and accessible to people who face hard things in their own lives. Gettysburg, Memory, Rhetoric, and Reality. At the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, Abraham Lincoln stepped up and gave a very short speech that would reshape how the nation remembered a terrible battlefield. He spoke after a much longer oration by a famous speaker of the day, and his few sentences, about 272 words, cut straight to the meaning of sacrifice and the future of the country. The choice to speak briefly was itself meaningful. While long speeches can list facts and honor many names, short statements often stick in the mind like a tune you can't stop humming. Lincoln used clear, simple language and a handful of rhetorical tools that are easy to spot when you know what to look for. One is repetition at the start of phrases, which helps the listener remember a point. For example, repeating the same opening words is like tapping a table to keep people's attention. Another device is pairing opposite ideas to show contrast, which helps explain a complicated reality in plain terms: freedom versus slavery, unity versus division. Think of it like explaining a recipe by comparing a messy pile of ingredients with the final neatly plated dish. The contrast makes the goal clearer. These techniques are not just ancient tricks reserved for famous speeches, they are the same tools people use when giving toasts at weddings, consoling a friend, or writing a concise message that needs to be remembered. Memory of the battle and of Lincoln's words has been shaped by monuments, school lessons, family stories, and public ceremonies, all of which pick out certain facts and leave others in the shadow. People visit the battlefield today and see rows of marble markers, statues, and plaques. Those objects tell a story, but they do not capture the confusion, the noise, or the small acts of kindness that occurred among the carnage. This is how communal memory works. It simplifies and highlights to make sense of horror. A practical example is how families keep a photograph to remember a loved one. The picture is powerful, but it cannot show the person's voice or the smell of their cooking. That is why historians and visitors try to balance monuments and textbooks with diaries, letters, and objects that add texture to what is remembered. Reality on the ground was messy, violent, and immediate in ways that monuments and speeches can never fully convey. The landscape itself, hills, ridges, and lanes, shaped how units moved and how attacks succeeded or failed. One famous assault was repulsed with heavy losses, and tens of thousands of men on both sides were killed, wounded, or missing in the aftermath. Numbers, while important, are cold tools for measuring human loss. A better way to grasp the reality is to think about the disruption in a small town after a natural disaster, when routines are gone, neighbors are sheltering together, and ordinary places feel unfamiliar. Humor helps sometimes, no monument can ever describe the mud that soldiers trudged through, or the frantic search for dry socks, but those small details hint at the human face of that huge, tragic event. Lincoln's brief words help to recast the battlefield's reality into a shared purpose, turning individual suffering into a claim about freedom and national survival. That rhetorical move, turning pain into promise, is common in public life, from a short eulogy that honors a neighbor's life to a short slogan that refocuses a company after a setback. The practical lesson is clear, precise, emotionally honest phrasing can change how people remember events and what they decide to do next. And yes, a short, meaningful line can be more powerful than a long speech. In many family gatherings, anyone who gives a 2-hour toast is politely ignored, whereas a sincere 2-sentence tribute is recalled for years. Reconstruction ideas and unfinished designs. During the Civil War era, Abraham Lincoln laid out a gentle but firm plan for bringing the Union back together, proposing that states which rebelled could be readmitted if a small portion of their voters pledged allegiance and accepted the end of slavery. That approach, often summed up as a modest threshold of loyal voters to form a new government, aimed to speed reconciliation while avoiding wholesale punishment. He offered broad pardons to many who took an oath of loyalty, though high-ranking Confederate leaders and those accused of serious crimes were excluded from automatic clemency. The goal was clear: restore functioning governments quickly so ordinary citizens could return to daily life, farms, and shops without endless occupation or reprisals. Lincoln's ideas collided with sharper proposals from members of his own party who wanted stricter terms and fuller protections for the newly freed people. One prominent congressional plan demanded stronger safeguards and tighter conditions for re-entry. Lincoln responded by refusing to sign it, effectively killing the measure without a formal veto. That move, called a pocket veto, is like closing the door on a plan when the legislature is not in session. It's quiet, final, and a little awkward for those who expected a debate. People wondered whether gentleness alone would protect the vulnerable, and disputes over balance between mercy and justice became the central political argument. He also entertained practical measures for the future of formerly enslaved people, suggesting limited voting rights for certain African Americans, notably those who were educated, who had served as soldiers, or who held other clear qualifications, while stopping short of universal suffrage. At the same time, he pressed Congress to adopt a constitutional change to permanently outlaw slavery. That was a structural design meant to ensure the old legal basis for bondage could not be easily restored. Lincoln had earlier supported compensated emancipation and even looked at schemes for voluntary relocation overseas as one option, ideas that sound strange today but were part of a long search for workable solutions in his mind. An everyday comparison helps. If a community is rebuilding after a flood, leaders might offer temporary housing, set rules for who receives government aid first, and propose permanent zoning changes to avoid future disaster. Lincoln's plans combined immediate relief with legal fixes meant to last. Many of those plans remained unfinished when he died, leaving a blueprint with important parts unwritten. His assassination removed the person most associated with reconciliation from the scene and opened the door to a much tougher program led by congressional opponents who feared too much leniency. The harder course that followed involved military oversight in some places and stricter conditions for re-entry, and debates about money, land, and civil rights stretched on. Lincoln's tone, hopeful, pragmatic, and marked by his famous wish to bind up the nation's wounds, with malice toward none, influenced later compromises even if his exact prescriptions were never fully realized. In short, he sketched a path back to normal life that mixed forgiveness, legal change, and limited protections, but his sudden death meant many of those designs remained drafts rather than finished plans, like a house with the roof started but several rooms still waiting for doors. Assassination, forensics and historical impact. While attending a play at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was struck in the head by a shot fired by John Wilkes Booth, an actor who fled the scene immediately afterward. Physicians found the wound deep and catastrophic. The bullet had entered the skull from behind and caused massive brain damage, leaving him unconscious and beyond help. A young Army surgeon, Charles Leal, was the first to reach him in the theater and did what he could with the tools available at the time. They moved him across the street to a boarding house where other doctors examined him and later performed an autopsy that confirmed the single gunshot wound as the cause of death. Forensics in that era looked very different from what people expect today. There were no 10th rays, no CT scans, and certainly no digital imaging. Doctors relied on careful inspection, simple instruments, and their knowledge of anatomy. Think of it like diagnosing a deep engine rattle by listening and poking rather than running the car through a computerized diagnostic machine. Physicians probed the wound to learn its path and examined the exposed brain tissue to judge the damage. Photographs and detailed written notes were made, because those were the best ways to record evidence for investigators and for the public record. The immediate historical impact was enormous and complicated. National mourning swept the country and public ceremonies followed, while political life was abruptly altered when the vice president assumed the presidency. That sudden change at the top shifted the tone and direction of Reconstruction policies. Lincoln had favored a relatively lenient reunification strategy, and his death removed a moderating force from the political debate. Citizens found themselves grieving not only for a leader but also for the loss of a particular vision for the nation's future. In everyday terms, it was as if a trusted coach left mid-season, and the team had to adjust to a new playbook under intense scrutiny. Forensic and investigative lessons from the case echoed forward through time. The lack of modern tools highlighted the importance of meticulous eyewitness accounts, careful medical notes, and secure preservation of physical evidence. Parts of the president's brain were preserved and later examined, attracting scientific and public attention and fueling debates about cause and consequence for years to come. Even now, historians and medical experts look back at the methods used as a reminder. Good records, clear descriptions, and careful custody of evidence matter as much as fancy equipment. A little grim, perhaps, but also a useful lesson. When technology can't yet help, clarity of observation and thorough documentation become the investigator's best friends. Legacy, memory, and popular scientific inquiry. Lincoln's words and image have been turned into touchstones for unity and moral leadership in everyday conversations and serious debates alike. People quote snippets of his speeches at graduations, courtrooms, and political rallies, and that steady presence in public life is part of his legacy. There are 5 known manuscript copies of one of his most famous short speeches, and scholars compare them to follow how his thinking changed as he revised. Schoolchildren still learn lines from his speeches, and the habit of carrying an iconic stovepipe hat, real or imagined, helps keep a human picture of him alive. It's easier to remember a tall man with a funny hat than an abstract idea about law. These tangible things, letters, drafts, even clothing, act like little anchors, helping memory resist the tide of time. Public memory does odd things sometimes, mixing fact and fiction until both are comfortable. He appears in everything from serious histories to novels that treat him as a larger-than-life character. Sometimes the historical Lincoln shares the stage with pure fantasy in popular culture, and people laugh or gasp, depending on the script. That mixture can be mischievous but useful. Myths simplify complexity and let a whole population hold on to a few clear lessons, though they also smooth over messy contradictions. Political leaders often borrow his phrasing to lend moral weight to an argument, much like a cook borrowing a cherished spice to improve a recipe. It works, but it doesn't recreate the original dish exactly. Scientific tools and methods have become part of how people study and remember him, and you don't need a lab coat to understand the basics. Textual analysis, for instance, is simply the careful comparison of words, like noticing that a friend uses a particular phrase in every message, and then using that pattern to decide which text is really theirs. Experts use similar techniques to compare drafts and authenticate handwritten documents. For physical objects, methods such as ink analysis or paper examination can tell whether a letter is truly old or a modern imitation. It's a bit like checking the weave of a family quilt to see if it came from grandma or the craft store. Archives and libraries have digitized countless documents and invited volunteers to transcribe them, turning a dusty pile of paper into searchable text that anyone can read and study. People also bring scientific curiosity to questions about health and behavior. Historians and medical researchers sometimes review descriptions of symptoms and contemporary medical notes to discuss whether he suffered from deep, recurring sadness or other conditions, and they show how mood and leadership can coexist. Those inquiries use simple principles: compare what was written, weigh the evidence, and admit uncertainty, just like a person comparing recipes to figure out why a cake sank. Forensics and material science help too, testing inks, examining signatures, and studying whereon objects can confirm authenticity or expose hoaxes. The result is a more nuanced memory, one that keeps the inspiring public image but also allows the messy, human details to show through. And if a discovery ever exonerated a rumor about his hat having secret pockets, school kids would be thrilled, until they find out it was just a normal hat after all. To sum up, Abraham Lincoln began life in a small log cabin, rose through honesty and hard work, led the country through the Civil War, and used the Emancipation Proclamation to take a clear stand for freedom. Think of it like unlocking a door that had been closed for too long. He believed in keeping a fragile union together, even when that meant making painful choices, and he did it with a mix of stubbornness, wit, and compassion. We also touched on his personal struggles and how his empathy and stubborn honesty shaped a nation. Imagine someone fixing a broken fence themselves instead of just complaining about it. If Lincoln's quiet courage and very tall hat made you smile or made you think, you're not alone. History can be both moving and a little human. If you enjoyed this gentle journey, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep exploring together. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the Gettysburg Address and what each famous line meant to everyday people then, and what it can mean for us now. Stay curious, and thanks for watching.